Welcome back to the Wisdom of Trauma Conversation series. My name is Maurizio Benazzo.
My name is Aya Benazzo, and we are the founders of Science and Non-Duality and the filmmakers.
Today's guest in conversation with Dr. Gabor Mater is Dr. Peter Levine.
Over the past 50 years, Dr. Peter Levine's pioneering work in the study of stress and trauma has shaped the way we understand our minds, our bodies, and in general, how trauma shapes our lives. His passion and tenacity for understanding natural laws and his fascination and engagement in life have guided him in developing his somatic experiencing body of work, which goes to the roots of trauma and gives us healing pathways.
Yeah, this conversation is really, to me personally, is incredible. You're talking about two giants, two pillar in the work of trauma, and actually I haven't seen many video conversation of the two of them. So this is, to me, is an historical moment. I only share how honored and touched we are to be hosting such a conversation. So welcome, Peter.
Welcome, Gabor, and thank you so much for being here.
So, hi, Peter. Nice to see you. First of all, thanks for doing this. Secondly, I don't know if you realize how important you've been in my life, but this whole trauma thing that I've become concerned with owes so much to your work. And more specifically, the book that really brought me to some public attention in the U.S. was only published in the U.S. because of your intervention in the realm of Hungry Ghosts. Nobody in the States wanted to touch it until you prevailed upon your publisher to bring it out. So I have a lot to thank.
Absolutely. You. Sure. No, when I read it, I just said, this is the book that has to come out. You know,
yeah.
It was one of a kind. At the time, really, it was unique.
Can I ask you a bunch of questions now?
Yeah, that's fine. By the way, maybe at the end we could have some feedback, maybe to give you, because I watched your documentary.
Oh yeah. Oh sure.
So we can do that afterwards.
Well, I'll tell you one thing right away about the documentary that I'm not comfortable with, which is that it focuses on me so much, but I'm hardly unique in the trauma world, and so many people like yourself and others who were pioneers are not even mentioned in the film. So that's a limitation of the film. It kind of focuses on one person, but it's not by any means a comprehensive look at the trauma world and what has been learned in it.
Yeah, but I think the main point was around addiction. But but these things are hardly perfect.
Yeah, well, fair enough. So what I'd like to ask you about then is, well, what do you want to say about addiction? Say it now.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, addiction is as complex as human behavior is. We're going everywhere from, brain stuff to people just needing some way to blunt their pain, to a way to attempt to regulate this inner distress. A maladaptive attempt, of course, but an attempt all the same. And until people find tools that are better than addiction, then addiction will continue to be driven. I mean, I think it's that simple. And addiction to different drugs, I think, also has different developmental routes. For example, I've noticed a lot of people with opioid addiction, have had a lot of birth trauma, birth stress, and those where there has not been consistent boundaries, 18 months, 2 years old, they more likely to use stimulants, cocaine and amphetamines and so forth. So again, it's a very complicated, very, very complicated business. And I think people are really just starting to look at this complexity, because to understand, because one treatment doesn't work for all. if you're not also looking at some of these other ones like developmental components.
Well, absolutely. And it's interesting what you say about birth trauma or perinatal trauma, because natural birth itself, as you know, releases this love, they call it this love cocktail in both the mother and the infant. And those love cocktail includes brain chemicals like oxytocin, but also the internal opiates, the endorphins.
Exactly.
So it would make sense. So it would make sense that with this birth trauma, or for that matter, the terrible rate of cesarean sections right now, which interfere with the natural birth, these kids are not getting their endorphins hit as they're being born. Their brains then don't develop the systems for it. So it's an interesting question that you raise. One thing I've never been able to answer. I agree with you that trauma is all about self-regulation. People trying to regulate their internal, addictions are about self-regulation. People are trying to get to a more manageable internal state through the addictive behavior of the drug. What I don't have a good theory for is why one person goes one way and one person goes another way. Why does somebody become a shopping addict, somebody else a sex addict, somebody else an opiate addict, somebody else a cocaine addict? Are you saying that from the point of view of developmental trauma, you have some answers to those questions?
Well, I think so. I mean, I think the type of addiction and the way it's playing out gives you some real hints of what's going on, what the maladaptive behaviors are, and what the pain is like. So I think really, in a way, somebody asked me once, if you don't know a person's trauma, how can they work with it? And I said, you don't have to know anybody's trauma. It's in the body, absolutely. It's there in terms of symptoms, bodily symptoms, physical symptoms, or also in terms of hauntings, in terms of just emotions just bursting out for no apparent reason. I think all of these things guide us back to the roots and give us a framework of knowing what to look for and how to work with an individual. Again, for example, 12-step programs, that's really in some way very, very an amazing process. It really is, but it's very limited. So if that's all you have, you work with people who have not used any substance or anything, for 40 years, and they say, hello, my name is such and such, I'm an addict.
I have a problem. I have the same problem with it, is that when people say that, they're not identifying themselves with their adaptation or with their dysfunction rather than with the whole self. Now, Peter, you mentioned the body, and I think it's fair to say that your most salient contribution has been working with the body. Now, in terms of therapy, you were not the first one to work with the body. Like, there was Reiki and work and all this kind of work decades before. But did anybody connect trauma with the body as clearly as you did before you did? That's what my question is. And if not, how did you come to that awareness of that trauma lives in the body itself?
Right. Well, I was certainly influenced by Reich. When I came out to California in 1964, I got a copy of the selected writings. And now, but again, his whole premise was neo-Freudian, that his premise was that all of neurosis was due to dammed up sexual energy. And there is some validity to that. But again, it's much more complex, and it's much more about trauma and how trauma gets lodged in the body. When I began to develop the pre-SE in the late 1960s, I had the disadvantage of, the advantage of not knowing, because PTSD was still another 15 years in the future as a diagnostic category, that I didn't know that trauma was a brain disorder a brain disease that couldn't be cured, but at best could be managed by certain medications and trying to change people's thoughts.
Yeah.
So I didn't have that misinformation at the time. That was the fortunate part. Then, you know, in when I started again working with people, I came to the conclusion that trauma is something that happens. Of course, it happens in the brain, it happens in the mind, it happens in the psyche, it happens in the spiritual sphere, it happens in so many different spheres. But the missing part was that it's something that happens in the body, and in a way that's so obvious. You see something that's frightening, or somebody's injured, and you go, oh, that's the body retracting. And when the body does that enough, it keeps replaying that and replaying that and replaying that until that becomes the chronic way that the body is holding those traumas. So by helping people have new experiences in their bodies, new experiences, those that contradicted the ones of overwhelming helplessness, of constriction and helplessness, then the trauma would sometimes mysteriously evaporate. I'm not saying it's a one-time situation. I mean, so many people, especially people who are dealing with addiction, have a whole complex developmental trauma history. So, but still, if you miss the part that's in the body, you're really missing that. You know, Archimedes said, give me a place to put my fulcrum and I'll move the world. And I think in terms of trauma, it is the body. That is where that lever is, that can give us new experiences, that give us authentic regulation, authentic connection with ourselves. Because the whole, for example, abdominal area of the body, that entire area is really where our primary sense of selfhood, our primary capacity to feel goodness emanates from. But if trauma is replaying itself, we're unable to connect to that authentic part, that true self, through the visceral sense and the lung and heart sense.
There's a very famous story that you tell that to me is very striking. Of it's almost like comes to you like an epiphany. A woman is in your office, and something happens, and all of a sudden you tell her to run. Isn't that the case? Or you just sense that there's some unexpressed energy in here, and you encourage her to express the energy, and that seems to have been kind of a focal point for you, where all of a sudden you realize something.
Yeah, that was definitely an epiphany. I mean, after that session, I knew my life would not ever be the same. I didn't realize how different it would be, but it was clearly a turning point. And this was a woman. She was suffering from severe, many physical symptoms. We now call fibromyalgia, irritable bowel, chronic fatigue, so forth. But also severe panic attacks and agoraphobia. She couldn't even leave the house unless she was holding on to her husband's arms. So when I started to work with her, what came up was an image of when she was 4 years old, so it was 20 years before, and she was being held down by doctors and nurses with a mask. The ether mask was put on her face for a tonsillectomy. So her whole body for 20 years had wanted to run from that situation, but being held down, she was unable to do it. And then what gave me the insight was an image that I had, what you referred to, at the far end of the consultation room. I could see an image of a tiger crouching, getting ready to pounce. And that's when I said, not at the time, not quite knowing why, Nancy, there's a tiger chasing you. Run, climb those rocks and escape. And I could see that she still was stuck. She couldn't move. And I encouraged her. I said, you can do it, Nancy. Just feel your legs. And all of a sudden, her body starts to shake and tremble. Her hands turn icy cold and then warm. takes deep, spontaneous breaths, a whole pattern which I recognized later as being a key in people moving out of trauma. Anyhow, when she got up to the top, she looked down and she saw the tiger, but then the tiger and she felt safe because the tiger couldn't get her. She felt safe, very important in trauma therapy. And she saw herself as the 4-year-old child and could feel that she was, again, belatedly escaping from that nightmare. So again, that's an important aspect of trauma, to help people find these experiences, these new experiences that the body couldn't do at the time, because children are so small and adults are so big. So how does a child, protect themselves when there's injury, and from the parent, propagated by the parents or the caregivers.
So the question that comes up for me is that I'm often asked actually is, like, first of all, if you had simply asked this woman, have you ever been traumatized? She would have said no, because she wouldn't have recognized that experience as trauma. And people often don't recognize their experiences as traumatic, number one. Number two, the question I'm often asked, and you must be asked as well, what if somebody can't give you that story of being held down prior to anesthesia or prior to surgery? What if there's no clear recollection of an incident or a set of incidents, but they're in their bodies, they're still carrying the traumatic imprint? My answer is always, well, it's good to know, but you don't have to, because it's actually showing up in the present anyway. How do you deal with
exactly.
How do you deal with that?
Just that way. Yeah. It plays itself out in the present, in emotional reactions, and specifically in bodily reactions. But there's procedural memories, so-called body memories. And this is an area that not only lay people, but I would say almost a majority of therapists don't recognize as being a key in resolving traumatic reactions, that these memories occur way below the mind, that they really are things, again, like with Nancy, she had wanted to run, but she couldn't. Those were procedural memories. Anyhow, that was the motivation for writing my most recent book, Trauma and Memory, Brain and Body in a Search for the Living Past, because it does play on our bodies in the past, without context. But when we work with the procedural memories, then we begin to find a context, and it can then become narrative. And it's necessary, it's important to be able to form a narrative recollection of what has happened to us and how it's affected us, and to demonstrate that compassion to that wounded child. So we need to be able to do all of that, but we have to start for where it resides, and where it resides is in the body, no question.
And on the other side of it, for quite some time, I could have told you a narrative of what happened to me just because I've been told what happened to me. But the narrative, or at least the cognitive awareness of what happened, did not by itself release me from the hold of those traumatic experiences. So knowing intellectually is interesting, but it's certainly not enough.
Yeah, and actually sometimes it's not just interesting, but it can be even damaging. I'll give you an example, very common. I'll work with somebody, let's just say they're in a heterosexual couple, and the person has come to me because they've already had therapy, and in therapy they uncovered, and there were many emotions associated with her being abused sexually as a young child. But then whenever her beloved partner touched her, she went into the freeze, and she felt even worse because now she knew what had happened, but she was still helpless in changing her response. So it really is essential to work both top down and bottom up, but primarily initially bottom up, because then you have the bodily experience, the affective experience, and then you can connect it to the cognitive, narrative, autobiographical functions.
Now, another essential teaching that I absorbed from you largely is that, and maybe if I'm misinterpreting, but I'll have your take on it, is that trauma is not actually what happens to you. It's what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. And the essence of trauma, you say in one of your teachings, is a disconnection. So can you comment on those two concepts of, number one, that trauma really is not the external event, but it's the internal response to it, number one, and number two, a core aspect of what happens internal to ourselves is that disconnection from ourselves.
Right. Well, it's certainly important to what we hold inside. That's absolutely essential. But it's also what we hold inside in the absence of a empathic, present person.
Yes.
And therapists can often provide that, but still they need the tools, because without the tools, trauma continues to rule. When you have the tools and the connection, then people can really begin to come to a sense of safety and okayness. And I think also you actually said something about this in the documentary about our disconnection, because trauma disconnects us from ourselves, because it would be too painful to be able to feel so small. And I noticed you had some scenes from prison population, and I remember way back in the 70s, I did some work with a group of prisoners at San Quentin, and these were a group of men who had beaten their spouses, or in a number of cases murdered them. And what we came to is, I was working with this one man, and he felt this rage, and so I had him just feel the rage, and hold his arms up and just feel. Don't express it, but just feel it. And then he just broke down sobbing. And he said, "I'll never let you make me feel so small again." All of the men started crying, started sobbing. So, there are good reasons why we disconnect, but they never work out. They always are maladaptive.
I've been to San Quentin as well, and I was sitting with a group of men, all of whom had killed, when they were quite young. And I don't know how to say this, but I've never sat with a more sweeter group of people in my whole life. With people that were more heart open. No, they'd been doing some work. They didn't just come to me,
I see.
So there are underneath that hardness, those hardened criminals. They're often the most sensitive, softest hearts. And,
yes.
And it's so frustrating to watch the system continue to hurt them and punish them rather than to help them develop.
I know. I don't want to go too much off on this track, but to put people in solitary confinement who are traumatized, even if they haven't been traumatized, they have been traumatized. They will be traumatized by something like that, the sense of isolation. And I think often prisoners, all of us, go in one or two directions. We either get meaner and hateful, or we become more compassionate to ourselves and to others. And I think that's what you're describing with the group that you work with in San Quentin, that they really can support each other. I every year I do some work with a group of so-called male sexual addicts. And, I've worked with many different groups, but this group, more than any other group, is really supportive of each other. And if they know somebody really needs to do some work, they will encourage them to come up and sit together with me. I mean, I'm really touched by their kindness. And I think when the armor breaks down, like you're describing in the San Quentin, then the softness can emerge.
Now, in one of your, I think it's in Unspoken Voice, you, for which I had the honor of writing the foreword.
Right.
So I'll take full credit for whatever success that book has had. You talk about your own experience of being wounded in an accident and what helped you move through that experience so that you weren't traumatized by it. Can you talk about that part of how things can happen, but they don't need to traumatize us?
Yeah. Well, this was, I was walking across the street, my dear friend's 70th birthday. And as I walked across the street, there was a truck. It was a stop sign, and there was a truck, and a teenage driver who didn't see the truck went right past and then hit me at about 25 miles an hour, threw me up against the windshield and then to the ground. And I'll skip a couple of pieces here, but literally I was out of my body. It was as though, it was as though I were above, looking down and seeing myself sprawled out on the ground. And at that time, a woman came up and knelt down. She didn't talk to me from above, which somebody else did, which just is what actually threw me out of my body. She sat down next to me and said, "Is there?" And I'm a doctor. Actually, I'm a pediatrician. I remember thinking, that's exactly the kind of doctor I need right now. Is there anything that I can do? And I said, yeah, please sit down and just stay here. And so she took her hand and put her hand on my hand. And just that physical act of touch was enough to bring me back into my body, so that I could actually then discharge that trauma, or that, so it didn't become trauma, just like with Nancy. So it was absolutely, again, I say, as much as I know, and I've guided thousands and thousands of people, traumatized people.
Yes.
Even with all of my knowledge and all of my experience, I don't think I could have done it without that person's presence. So like we were saying before, it's not just what happened to us. It's not just what we hold inside, but what we hold inside in the absence of the empathic other.
Well, which reminds me of another important question, which has to do with the very definition of trauma. So, it's just hard to find enough words to express the whole range and nuance of human experience. But trauma, we often think about it as these terrible things that happen to people, and they often do.
Yeah,
I mean, it's happening in the world right now. I was talking to a Palestinian woman a few weeks ago before the present horror, and she works with children who've been in Israeli jails. And she said, in Jericho. And she does dance and meditation with them.
Yeah.
She says, you would appreciate it. She says Sufi dervish whirling with them. And but she says there's no post-traumatic stress disorder here, because there's no post-trauma. It's always going on.
Yeah.
So there's all these terrible things that happen to people that shouldn't.
Yeah.
But I see a lot of people who these terrible things didn't happen, but just for their little sadnesses or their little griefs or their little upsets, there was nobody there to connect with. And that was enough to wound them. So trauma doesn't have to be, in my experience, it doesn't have to be these terrible things. It could also be just the absence of that presence that you're talking about. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Here's a little example, I think, that ties all of these things together. So I was also in the Middle East before the last Intifada. So that must have been at least 20, 25 years ago.
Yeah.
And I did it under the condition that they agreed, it was in Jerusalem, that they agreed to bring people from the Palestinian mental health, from Gaza mental health and West Bank. And somebody asked the question, can you work with a person if you don't know what their trauma is? And that's when I said, yes, you can, because all you need is a symptom or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So this man, Chaim, got up. I'm sure he's not alive anymore. And he had pioneered psychoanalytic treatment of Holocaust survivors. So he came up and said that he'd have back pain for 30 years. It was interesting. He gave an exact time, 30 years. So I said, well, why don't you, if you want, you can come up. So he came up. And so I had him be able to focus beneath the pain. What were the muscle tension like? And he could feel that. I said, is it even or is it more on one side or the other? He said, it's much more on my right. And if you let that tension actually move your body very slowly, and then he did that, and then he started to fall backwards. So I put my hand at the back of his head so he wouldn't fall. And he started to shake and tremble. You could literally see sweat by his feet. And this went on for about 40 minutes. We later found out what it was. He'd actually been an army doctor, and he was together with in a truck with the soldiers, and they were ambushed. And so he fell out into a ditch on his back. And then when he crawled out, everybody had been brutally murdered. So that's what he was holding. So I could see, especially because there was no content at the time, I could see everybody was like both touched and confused. And so I asked if anybody had anything they wanted to share. So this one woman, very striking woman, a psychologist from Gaza Mental Health, stood up and she said, Chaim, when you came up to work with Dr. Levine, I was praying that you would be re-traumatized.
Yeah.
Because I have nothing but hatred, because your people have killed my people, have humiliated my people.
Yes.
And I just wanted you to suffer. But she said something happened, and I couldn't explain it. But all of a sudden, I felt this compassion for you. And I was praying that you would find healing. And Chaim, I realized until we find peace within ourselves, we will never be able to find peace with each other. And that really deeply moved me.
And that is so poetic, which brings me to another question, maybe the second to last one. You often seem to cite poetry or speak poetically in your books and in your speaking. What's your connection to poetry and trauma?
Oh gosh, I mean, poetry is the window into not only into trauma but into healing. I'm not saying by itself it heals trauma, but poetry is so important in our lives. Whether we recognize it or not.
Yes.
It gives us a way to express our feelings through words, and that's an important link, I believe.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Look, finally, I'd just be really curious with your very honest take on this film. What do you like about it? What do you think is missing? What do you think could be different?
As I said before, documentaries are never perfect, and you have to do enough to make it engaging. And then maybe when you do that, you miss some important aspects and maybe don't get different views and so forth. But I think anything that helps people understand trauma and how trauma affects our lives and how medicine is floundering without an understanding of trauma. I mean, it really is. Education. These children seem to be acting out or being disruptive. So you push them out of the class. They have to go to the principal's office, things like that. So finally, I think, with the help of a number of people, starting especially with Vince Felitti, the ACE studies and your work, I think people are realizing that we can't deny this anymore. And if we just choose to deny it, then we'll continue to repeat it. And the power of repetition is powerful indeed.
It's if I allow myself to be frustrated, which is a choice I can actually make, I realize I didn't used to be able to make that choice, but I'm better at it. But one of the things that can get me frustrated is what you just said, is that we have all this evidence for the impact of trauma on physical and mental well-being, or the lack of it. And I mean, the research is exhaustive, it's complete, it's fully documented, published in major journals, fully available. Yet the average physician, the average teacher, the average lawyer, they never even hear about it.
I know.
There's almost like it's an alternate universe,
right?
Which somewhat doesn't penetrate the practical world. Now it's beginning to. I mean, there's your work, there's my work. We're getting some attention. There's Bessel's book, which is a bestseller in the New York Times. There's a new book with Bruce Perry and Oprah, What Happened to You. So the conversation, it is promising, but the promise is still so far away from reality.
When I asked asked Felitti about, he was at Kaiser, and I said, and this was again before it became sort of mainstream. I said, doesn't that frustrate you, that you see that these things could really change medicine and education, and nobody really seems to be running with it? And he looked at me with wisdom and said, Peter, to be quite frank with you, medicine is very conservative and it takes time to change. But when it does change, then it tends to become standard practice. I'm doing a class for a bunch of mostly medical doctors, functional medicine doctors on Sunday.
Oh, good.
And I was looking up some of the statistics that 90% of people who go to see a physician for their symptoms, that no cause can be found. 90%. So you think, well, wouldn't you want to know what's driving that 90%?
Yeah.
And so, I think people are speaking out. There are in some documentaries. I noticed Prince Harry is also starting another documentary and his experience. So the more the merrier.
As you know, I would argue even further that even when they can find a cause, like malignancy or an autoimmune disease or whatever, it's still rooted in trauma. Not just when we do it. Now, let me tell you a funny story about Vince Felitti and Kaiser Permanente. So some years ago, Vince Felitti, for those of you that may not know, is the initial and chief investigator for the Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies. He's a internal medicine specialist in San Diego, working, as Peter said, in the Kaiser Permanente system. Some years after my book on addiction got published in the States, I got an invitation from Kaiser Permanente in California to come and speak about addiction. But they called me before I came and they said, well, is there any literature that supports your findings that addiction is related to trauma? I said, yes. In the Kaiser Permanente system, there were these famous studies called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies. They said, really? The studies were done in their system. They didn't know about it. And when I came and spoke to that group, this is in Kaiser Permanente, and I said, how many of you heard of the AC studies? 40% of them put their hands up.
Wow. Yeah. One of the things I also asked Felitti, I said, my experience is that a lot of trauma comes not just from, what we call, I guess, developmental trauma, or lack of, attention or violence in the home, but can come from, like with that woman, Nancy, from medical trauma. Yeah. So I asked him, I said, was there any reason why you didn't list medical trauma? And then I realized, oh my God, I should close my mouth. Well, of course, in Kaiser, they're not going to want to know about medical trauma. Not going to,
Yeah.
But he said, no, this is so important. And if he did a study again, he would include things like accidents, like I had, medical trauma. I've worked with many people, for example, who have woken up during general anesthesia in a surgery. And I'm telling you, that's the most horrific of all traumas. And it may not happen where a lot of people wake up fully, but a lot of people come in and out of wakefulness. And so even what the physicians are talking about is being registered. And a lot of times, for example, I've worked with people and they come in that they know that they're sick, that they're not going to get well. I wonder, where is that coming from? Well, in a number of cases, doctors were talking about an affair that they had with a nurse, and it got registered, in their mind as there was something wrong with them. And so these kept replaying. I mean, you would think, how could that happen? But it does, So I always, if with anybody I'm helping to, for pre-surgery, I always have them talk to the surgeon and the anesthesiologist to not make any, random talk, and only to say things like, "Oh, the surgery went very well. We will predict a good recovery," saying something like that. Yeah. But again, these things get registered in implicit memory.
I know, and as people, especially as people in authority, we're not aware of the power that we have to hurt people sometimes.
That's right.
Peter, thank you so much for this conversation. It's a pleasure to see you again, and I look forward to the next time.
Okay.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for this conversation. Peter, actually, you remind me all of a sudden when you were talking about the child, Nancy, being held. I remember I started weeping because I remember it happened to me for a tonsilite, that I was held and they had to inject me and bring me an injection and bring me to the operation room because I definitely didn't want that. And I never put that together, how impactful it has been for me. And I remember that sense of terror all of a sudden it hit me again. Yeah.
Thank you both, and we hope soon to perhaps have you both teach in person at one of our events.
Yes,
it will be a dream come true.
Yeah.
So thank you for being here and for your wisdom and energy.